Hey, this is Jamey with Stillmeyer Games, and for today's Sunday sit-down video, to follow last week's video about games that are difficult to set up but totally worth the effort, this week I'm going to talk about games that are super easy to set up. And I'll talk about why I love easy setup games as I describe these different games, but I'll jump right in and talk about some honorable mentions and then the top 10. So first, I want to mention one game from Stillmeyer Games that I think is the easiest game of ours to set up, and that is Between Two Castles of Magic and Ludwig. This includes special inserts designed so that at the end of any given game of castles, which is a tile placement, tile drafting game, you kind of just gather all the tiles together and put them back in the insert, and the slots in the insert hold the exact number of tiles that you need to draw at the beginning of the next game. So as you are cleaning up the game, you are actually setting up for the next game. So at the beginning of the next game, all you have to do is choose one stack. You don't have to shuffle anything. You choose one stack of 9 tiles, get a throne room tile, and start playing. It's that simple. So I really like how the insert in Between Two Castles allows for really easy setup. That's one of our own games, so obviously that won't be on the top 10 list here. There are some honorable mentions here, all of which are very easy to set up, but I was very picky with this. I wanted games that really required you to not remember anything about setup, that made it very easy to get the game to the table, super easy to get the game to the table, and doesn't even require you to look in the rule book, ideally. So some games that came very close but didn't quite make it were On Tour, which has just a tiny little bit of fiddliness, requiring the original setup with some of the cards that you pull out of the deck, that you reveal and pull out. Ticket to Ride has just a tiny little bit of decision making at the beginning of the game, where you have to choose how many routes that you're going to keep. Unmatched, super easy setup in Unmatched, but there is just the tiniest bit of something that you have to remember regarding where you put characters on the board at the beginning of the game. Mansions of Madness, probably the most complex game on this list, but Mansions of Madness 2nd Edition does a great job with the app of kind of revealing things as you play. Instead of saying, okay, set up all this stuff, get out all these tiles at the beginning of the game, instead Mansions of Madness just says, start with this tile, turn on the app, and start playing. But it does involve a few things with your character that take a little extra setup time. So I didn't put it in the list. Hanabi, very easy to set up, but it does require some scaling elements. So scaling elements are something that I'll talk about in this video. Just a very slight scaling element in Hanabi. Scotland Yard, again, very easy to set up Scotland Yard, but it is a little fiddly, at least the edition I have, with the number of tokens that each player needs to start with at the beginning of the game. Downforce, again, very easy to set up, but there are some decision points that you have to make before the game, which can make the game. This is one of the things about setup. If you give players decisions to make before you actually start playing the game, it makes the game slightly less accessible, because it means that you're introducing new players to concepts that they don't fully understand yet. Downforce has that. Otherwise, it's a wonderful introductory game. I think that's it for honorable mention. So I'll jump right in to number 10 on the list, which is Love Letter. Love Letter, here's the Hobbit edition of Love Letter. Love Letter has a super easy setup where you're basically, I believe each player just gets one card. The entire setup, let's see what the setup rules in Love Letter say. Setup, you shuffle the deck, remove the top card from the deck without looking at it. Easy to remember rule, that is in the rule book, you might forget it, but if you do forget it, that's fine too. And then, there is actually a little bit of scaling here. In a 2-player game, take 3 more cards from the top of the deck and place them to the side. Each player draws 1 card and starts playing. So that's number 10, because there is a little bit of a scaling element here. Hanabi possibly could have taken this position on the list. But Love Letter takes, 10 seconds to set up. You shuffle the deck, you remove a card, and each player draws a card. Super easy way to get you started playing the game instead of getting caught up in a lot of setup steps. Now, I should say at this point that there are a lot of very more complex games that could have made this list and that aren't on this list. These are a lot of games that are simpler, that are shorter. But these are also very popular games. And I think that is somewhat tied to the setup, because there is a gratification that I think you can get by taking a lot of time to set up a complex game and then playing that game and having fun. But it is also a lot of fun just to sit down to select a game and be playing that game within 2 minutes. That is really satisfying, whether there are new players or not even. So that's one of the reasons that Love Letter is number 10 on this list. My number 9 favorite game that is super easy to set up is Coup. In Coup, the setup, I just looked through the rulebook a minute ago. The setup is super easy. You're shuffling the deck. You're giving each player 2 cards and 2 coins and a reference mat, and then you start playing. It's that easy. Again, simpler, shorter game in Coup, but in that each turn it's a bluffing game involving your different characters. But I love how simple and streamlined the setup is in Coup. It lets players just start playing right away. I have a bunch of notes over here about things. Oh, yeah. So, I'll come back to that in a second. So, yeah, I'll jump on to number 8 here, which is Carcassonne. I don't own Carcassonne. Classic game, tile laying game, and Carcassonne, especially in the newer editions of it, does something really clever in that all the tiles go into a big bag that you're drawing from. At least I'm pretty sure they are. This is the version of Carcassonne that I played fairly recently. It could have been a friend's bag I was using. If it's not a bag, then Carcassonne doesn't belong on this list. Because if it is a bag, especially with tiles, it makes shuffling those tiles so much easier because you can always just keep them in the bag. The same goes for Ra. The same goes for Isle of Skye. That instead of having tiles that you need to shuffle, because tiles do not shuffle well, you can always just keep them in the bag, and the bag is essentially always shuffled. As you reach into the bag, you can kind of shuffle it yourself with your hand. So in Carcassonne, the setup is super, super easy. All you do is put a tile in the middle of the table, you put your score tokens on the scoreboard, and I think each player draws 1 tile. But you might even do that at the beginning of your turn in Carcassonne. So the setup is super streamlined in the game, and it's all aided by that component of the bag. So instead of even having to shuffle a deck of cards, which can add even a tiny bit of time, setup time to a game, all you do is put all those tiles in the bag and select from it. So that's Carcassonne, my number 8 game that is super easy to set up, that I also really enjoy. My number 7 game on this list is That's Pretty Clever, or Ganz, Schon clever. This is a roll and write game where the setup. As I was preparing for this video, I was kind of looking at the rulebook to see, is setup more complicated than I'm making it out to be? But it isn't. The entire setup is listed in this tiny paragraph right here in the rulebook. It says, each player receives a felt tip pen and score sheet. Randomly choose the starting player who picks up the 6 dice. And that's it. That's the entire setup. All you were doing is choosing a score sheet and a pen, basically, and a starting player, and you get to start playing. So I love how quickly and easily you can get into Ganz, Schon clever. One thing I'll mention here is that there's no player scaling. I think a lot of times with games with setup, the setup can be bogged down by laborious player scaling. And I've talked about this on a recent video about maps. I think, and actually I talked about it in another video about multiplayer games that play well at 2 players. I really like it when games acknowledge that it's okay for a game to feel different at different player counts. And some games don't. Ganz, Schon clever doesn't really feel different at different player counts. But I think it's okay if games do. And so sometimes games go way out of their way to make setup more complicated so it scales like perfectly mathematically well. So the game always feels exactly the same based on the player count. 7 Wonders is the one that comes to mind with this. 7 Wonders has all these different cards that you have to remove during setup. Or add in if you've removed them for a previous game based on the player scaling. And I love it when games just say, we're not going to think about that. Or we're going to think about that. We're going to acknowledge it, but we're going to acknowledge that it's okay for the game to feel a little different at different player counts. And that removes a lot of laborious setup, as in Ganz, Schon clever. Super easy setup. That's why it's my number 7 game on the list. My number 6 favorite game that is also super easy to set up is The Crew. The Crew is the rare game on this list. This is a cooperative trick-taking game. This is the rare game on this list where you actually have to look at the rulebook. And I love, really even on the honorable mentions on this list, a few of them I eliminated because there are a few things that I don't remember that I would need to look at the rulebook for. I love it when games integrate the things that you need to remember for setup into the board or into your player mats or into even a reference card that you can pull out. And it says, here's what you got to do for setup. In The Crew, it does it in an interesting way because in The Crew, you're playing through various missions, and it does require you to open the rulebook, but the point of it is so you can look at the current mission, and the current mission tells you the rule for that mission, which might be, it's basically like the number of task cards that you need to complete, maybe the order that you need to complete them in, things like that. There's a little bit of shuffling in The Crew, but it doesn't take much time. You're pretty much in any player count other than 2 players, you are just shuffling up cards and dealing them out to all players, and then looking at the mission guide in the rulebook to determine what you're doing for that mission. So I like how simple and streamlined that makes it. It says, look at this one place. You always look at this one specific place for the current mission, and that's what you got to do for this mission. And it's never complicated. It's usually just put these tokens next to these task cards. But in general, I also just really like in games where the number of cards that you need to put face up on the table, instead of making you remember that it's integrated somehow into a reference card or into the board itself, so that you don't have to remember that, so that the game remembers it for you. An example of this in one of our games is Scythe. And in Scythe, your player mat and your faction mat tell you what you get to start with at the beginning of the game, the amount of money, the number of combat cards, things like that. So you don't have to refer to the rulebook. All you have to do is look at your player mat and your faction mat, and it tells you what you get to start with. Anyway, that's the Crew, my number 6 favorite game that is very easy to set up. My number 5 favorite game that's super easy to set up is The Mind. This is another game on this list where you literally just open the box and start playing. You shuffle the deck and start playing. You deal out 1 card to each player. But other than that, if I want to play The Mind with someone, I can be playing it within a minute, because that's all you're doing. You're shuffling the cards, you're dealing 1 to each player. It even starts out at a very basic level. Similar to the Crew, you start with a very simple mission. In the Mind, your first mission is each player gets 1 card, and you have to play those cards in sequential order without communicating. Another cooperative game here. Several different cooperative games on this list. But I love how simple this is. Obviously, this is inherently also a very simple game, but I just love how simple the setup is. It doesn't scale. There's no weird scaling rules. There's no decisions that you need to make before you start. There's no different combinations of components that you need to figure out. You just shuffle a deck, deal 1 card to each player, and start playing. That's The Mind, my number 5 favorite game. It also just happens to be a game that I really enjoy. So that's why it's the number 5 game on this list. I'm looking through my... Oh, yeah. So there's one thing. Let's see if this will come up. I'll talk about it in a second. But my number 4 favorite game on this list is Blokus. Blokus is an abstract game where each player has the same exact set of polyomino tiles, and you put them on the board. You take turns putting them on the board. The setup is... there is almost no setup, because you're basically just opening the box, putting the blank board on the table, and gathering your tokens. So Blokus removes all asymmetry. There's no decision points at all at the beginning of the game, because all players have the exact same thing. You do have to determine a start player. I don't even know the rules for start player, but it doesn't really matter. You can do it randomly based on you can just shuffle up 1 piece per player, and you have the start player. But I really like, and Blokus is kind of an extreme example of this, but there are lots of games where there's a lot of board set up to be done to create variability in the game. And Blokus, I think, shows that you don't need to have a bunch of different tiles that are always different on the board, or each player has a different set of tiles to have variability. Because every game in Blokus I played has felt a little different. And that emerges from the gameplay itself, from what the players do, the players' interaction, the players' choices. So I really do like in games where you don't have a lot of stuff that you need to do on the board to set it up to create that variability. The variability comes from the decisions players make instead, and how those decisions impact other players during the game. And Blokus does that kind of to the extreme. That's why it's my number 4 game that is super easy to set up, that I also really enjoy. My number 3 favorite game that is super easy to set up is the cooperative game Just One. In Just One, it's a cooperative game where each player has a little stand where you're going to be writing things with a dry erase marker. So all you need is that stand, a dry erase marker, and then you shuffle a deck of cards and put 1 of those cards on 1 player's stand, facing away from them, so that other players can help them guess the word on that stand. And that's it. Super easy, no scaling, no weird setup variability set up for a board. There's very little shuffling. You're not shuffling a lot of different decks. You're just shuffling 1 deck, and really, you could probably choose a part of the deck that you didn't use in the previous game. You don't even need to shuffle it, because the cards in Just One have multiple words on them, and so it kind of eliminates a lot of the need for shuffling, because the variability can come from the variety that's on the cards themselves. So Just One, super easy setup, just a lot of fun to play. Again, it's a lighter game, it's a shorter game, but I think that's okay. I sometimes think that can make a game get to the table a lot more often, because it's so so easy to actually get to the table in the first place. And that is the epitome of just one. What do we got next? Yeah, one of my favorite games here, Fantasy Realms. Number 2 favorite game that is super easy to set up. All you're doing in Fantasy Realms is set up the game, shuffle the deck, give each player 7 cards, put the deck on the table, and you're done. That's it. It's a hand management game. So at the beginning of the game, you're going to have 7 cards. At the end of the game, you're also probably going to have 7 cards. Throughout the game, you are getting rid of cards and gaining cards into your deck or into your hand. But it just makes setup super easy. The only part about setup that I guess is a little weird about Fantasy Realms is that you actually have to look at all your cards and read through them before you can make any decision in the game. That can be a little daunting for a new player, but the actual setup process itself of getting those cards to the players is super easy. You're just shuffling the deck and dealing 7 cards to each player. One thing I wanted to mention in this list, I don't even know if it applies here, is that I do love, I guess it isn't really here, but in games that are a little bit more complex, I do like when they have a clear setup graphic that walks you through those steps. But even better than that is a game that doesn't require you to look at the rulebook to set it up. Fantasy Realms, I think, maybe even could have done this a little bit better to remind you of that magic number of 7, because if anything, that's the number to look up. How many cards do you start with in your hand? And I'm not sure, they could have incorporated that number 7 into the box or maybe some design element on the cards. I'm going to check the cards to see if there isn't. No, there isn't. But they could have incorporated the number 7 somewhere into the backs of the cards to kind of remind you, hey, 7 is the magic number here. 7 is the number of cards that you need to shuffle and hand out, or to give each player. But other than that, I think the setup is so wonderful, and I think the game is so wonderful. That's why it's so high on the list, and that's why Fantasy Realms is at number 2. I think I've talked through all my little, little concepts here that I wanted to describe here. But let's just jump to number 1, and that is my favorite version of Azul Summer Pavilion. You could put this version of Azul or the original Azul on this list. They both apply. The game itself is so easy that they explain it on the back of the box, but the setup itself, and this is, I think, the heaviest game on this list. It's not a super heavy game, but it is the heaviest game on this list. The setup is really, really easy because, again, you have that bag that contains all the tokens, the tiles in the game. So all you do for the setup in Azul is put the board on the table, give each player a player mat, and everything's already shuffled because it's in a bag, and then you seed each of the spots on the board for with 4 tiles. The magic number in Azul is 4. Super easy setup. I mean, it hardly takes any time, and even the setup feels good because it's fun to reach into that bag and grab some tiles and put them on the different spots on the board. I guess there is a scaling element, admittedly, as I'm talking about this, there is a scaling element regarding the number of tiles that you put out here. Maybe they could have made it a little bit easier to set up by telling you on those tiles, communicating on the tiles themselves, how many belong out on the table based on the player count. Because I do have to refer to the rulebook for that. I don't remember that when I play Azul. So that's maybe the one thing they could have done better. But I wanted to acknowledge that there are games that have more complex sets of decisions and rules, like Azul, Azul Summer Pavilion in particular, but are still super quick and easy to actually get to the table. The setup does not take a long time. You don't have to arrive at game night 30 minutes early just to set up the game for that night. Azul, you can just pull it out of the box and start playing within probably 3 minutes at most. And I think that's awesome. I think that's a wonderful thing about Azul and these other games that you can just sit down and start playing. And again, I think that means that they get to the table more often. And again, I want to bring up the Crew and Mansions of Madness, because even though Mansions of Madness wasn't on this list, because they do something that is really unique in terms of starting with and the Mind actually too, starting with very simple missions and scenarios and very little information on the table, so that players can just can kind of grok the original decision points in the game a lot easier based on kind of that setup and the decisions that they need to make. I think that's great. I think that's great when games do that. When they start off very simply and say, okay, here's a simple thing to do at the beginning of the game, and then kind of level it up from there. You get more and more information. Lords of Waterdeep does this too, actually. In Lords of Waterdeep, you start out with only a few basic actions, and the action spaces grow throughout the game as you build more buildings on the board. So you start off with less setup. You don't have to put out a bunch of tiles on the board during setup. and fewer decision points early in the game so that you can make decisions that branch out from there. It's easier to get into the game, get into the flow of the game, because there are fewer decisions to make early on. And I think some of these other games, these games with the easy setup, do that same thing, where they start off with a very easy scenario early on in the game, or very little information about the scenario, like in Mansions of Madness, that grows from there as you play, and as you kind of set up the game more and more as you play, rather than at the beginning of the game before you've made gameplay decisions. Yeah, and I guess the one other thing that I didn't talk too much about is the idea of not requiring players to make gameplay decisions before they actually start playing the game. That's why I eliminated Ticket to Ride from this list, even though Ticket to Ride is very easy to set up. I eliminated that because there is that little decision point in Ticket to Ride of which route to keep, or which routes, plural, to keep. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts about games that are super easy to set up, and why you like those games. I'm looking for games that you both enjoy and are easy to set up, because there are games, I'm sure, that are easy to set up but just aren't fun, or that you don't personally enjoy. These games on my list are games that I really do enjoy and also happen to be super easy to set up. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks.